So, forbearance agreement, loan modification agreement, mortgage repayment plan. Three very different ways to protect your home. These terms are used interchangeably by banks and servicers who sometimes are trying to trick you and sometimes don't know what they're talking about, and by scammers on the internet who absolutely are trying to trick you. So I'm going to walk you through the three, explain why it's important to understand the differences, and then I'm going to give you some tips at the end. We're going to start with the repayment plan. So the repayment plan is not a repayment of the entire loan. That's not what it is. A mortgage loan by itself is a repayment plan. You borrow $300,000, you agree to repay it over 30 years, that's a repayment plan. But the repayment plan, when we're talking about loss mitigation and mortgage servicing in your home, is a repayment not of the total amount outstanding on the mortgage loan, but the total amount outstanding that is presently due for the next payment. Meaning, if you're late 10 payments, then your mortgage repayment plan, were you to enter one, would be to catch up on those 10 payments while you made the next 10 payments, or however long the repayment plan was. So, are repayment plans useful? Generally, no. In 14 years of doing this, I think I've resolved 2 foreclosure cases with repayment plans. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. If you fell behind on your mortgage because your kid got sick, God forbid, you lost your job, any kind of thing that happened, it's out of your control 90% of the time, you fall behind. You get back to work, your income picks up. Is it going to be double what it was before so that you can make double payments for the next year? It's not really likely that that's ever going to happen. It does happen sometimes when people are lucky enough to have that happen, but it is so rare. It is so rare that the repayment plan really is usually not helpful. Now, I'm going to circle back to that and give you a warning about repayment plans and the CARES Act at the end. And so a forbearance agreement is not a permanent resolution of your mortgage situation. And this is a very tricky concept because unless you really understand what a forbearance agreement is, and I'm not talking about a CARES Act forbearance, which I will talk about at the end, but the traditional forbearance agreement is just a temporary reduction or elimination in the obligation to make the current payment. It's not a forgiveness of the payment, you still owe it. And the mortgage forbearance agreement and the repayment plan often come together, and that's where people got into trouble in the past years and with other experts who put them into forbearance agreements without properly explaining what they are. So, again, if you're late 10 months and you get into a forbearance agreement to give you time for whatever reason, that sounds great. You know, you're going to pay a partial payment as you get back on your feet. But at the end of the year or so often, you're 10 months back, and then you're also maybe another 6 months back because for the next 10 months, they gave you a partial forbearance agreement where you only had to pay half your mortgage. It sounds like a solution. It seems like a solution. People get fooled and stuck because at the end of the 20 months, they're back to 10, they owe those, and then they owe, half of the next 10. That's a giant number, and the bank says, gimme, or I'm going to file a foreclosure complaint. So forbearance agreements are tricky. Do I use them to resolve cases? Rarely, for the reasons I just explained. So a mortgage modification is not a new loan. It's not a new loan. It doesn't change the position in the first mortgage and the second mortgage you got on the property and any other liens. A mortgage modification is the current loan with changed terms. That's it. Let's say you have a 30-year loan, $300,000. You've been paying for 10 years. You owe about $250 or something. And at the end of those 10 years, you run into trouble. You can't make the payments. You work out a deal. And the bank and you agree to change the terms in accordance with the servicing guidelines and the investors' guidelines and all this complicated stuff I talk about in other videos. But the bottom line is the mortgage modification changes the terms. Now, instead of being 5% over 30 years, you're now 3% over 30 years. Or you're 4% over 40 years. Or there's a potential principal forgiveness if you make payments on time for 6 months. There's just so many different mechanisms, but the details as to what modifications are available and how to get them. But the bottom line is a mortgage modification, unlike a repayment plan, unlike a forbearance agreement, Mortgage modification is a permanent solution to your situation because it changes the terms. You start making the payments, you're current. It doesn't matter that you were late for those 10 months. You're now current. Nobody can say boo so long as you comply with the terms of the modification agreement. All of this explanation I've given you gets turned on its head by the CARES Act. Because the CARES Act makes forbearance agreements valuable. It eliminates repayment plans under the CARES Act, even though you're going to hear otherwise from other folks. And it creates situations in which the banks must give you a modification. It's called a streamlined modification just for the asking if you meet certain criteria under the CARES Act. All right, this video is getting too long to go through all the details of the CARES Act and how that changes your rights, but I've been through that a number of times in other videos. You can find it on the channel. You can find it on my website. Here's the tip. Stay away from repayment plans. Stay away from forbearance agreements, except the CARES Act forbearance agreement, and be very careful that you are getting the modification that you are entitled to. There are modifications, then there are modifications. It's easy to slot someone into a modification that's not the best possible modification. It takes a little more talent, work to get someone into the modification, the best modification to which they're entitled. That's the trick. That's the benefit. So don't get pushed into a repayment plan or a forbearance agreement unless it makes sense for your situation and unless you're talking to someone who can explain to you why it makes sense for your particular situation over a modification. I've gone through the three main concepts of the video. Difference between a forbearance agreement, a mortgage modification agreement, and a mortgage repayment plan. You understand those now. I've given you a couple of tips. Here's the final and most important tip. Don't do this alone. Don't work with a paralegal service. You need to work with a foreclosure defense attorney who understands what he or she is doing. You need an expert. Trying to do something of this importance and magnitude in your financial life on your own is next to insanity. You need the right advice to get to the right place, and you need a competent and good foreclosure defense attorney. If there's any questions or concerns, you can call me, you can reach out to me, put comments on the website, the YouTube channel, Facebook, anywhere. I'll answer them pretty much real time because this is important stuff for people to know. I could tell horror stories of people who did it on their own, but you don't need me to beat you up about your head and neck on this, okay? You know what you need to do. You need an expert and you need the right one, all right? Talk soon.